The sheep were gone, and Clara Belle knew her family couldn't survive another loss. She had counted them at dawn, all 37 head grazing peacefully in the east pasture. Now, with the morning sun climbing higher, only empty grass remained where her flock should have been. Clara wiped the sweat from her brow and studied the ground carefully. Her father, Boone, would be devastated if they lost the sheep. They were already behind on payments to Ezekiel Marsh's bank, and losing livestock would mean certain foreclosure. Following the faint hoofprints in the dry earth, she set off across the rolling hills. The tracks led toward the old Hendricks place, abandoned land that her father had always forbidden her to visit. He claimed the ground was unstable, but Clara suspected there were other reasons for his warnings. As she crested a ridge, she spotted her sheep clustered around something in the distance. There stood the crumbling remains of an old windmill, its wooden blades hanging motionless in the still air. Several planks were missing from years of neglect, and the structure leaned precariously. But what caught Clara's attention was her sheep's behavior. They were all gathered around the base, drinking from a natural spring that bubbled up through the foundation stones. As she approached to gather her flock, Clara noticed something peculiar about the windmill's base. Several large stones had been deliberately moved, creating a small opening just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Fresh scratches on the rock suggested recent disturbance, though this place had supposedly been abandoned for decades. Cool air drifted up from the gap, carrying the musty scent of age and hidden secrets. Clara glanced around nervously, then knelt beside the opening. Below, she could see wooden steps carved into the rock, leading down into what appeared to be a deliberately constructed chamber. Against every instinct telling her to leave, Clara lowered herself through the opening and descended into the hidden space. Someone had carved this chamber from the bedrock beneath the windmill and reinforced it with timber beams. It was clearly meant to be a secret hiding place where no one would think to look. Shafts of morning sunlight filtered down through cracks in the floorboards above, illuminating a makeshift table built into the rock wall. On it lay a collection of documents wrapped in oiled cloth, preserved against moisture and time. The papers looked old but well-maintained, as if someone had been keeping them safe for a very long time. Clara's hands trembled as she unwrapped the first document. What she found had been hidden here for 50 years, a detailed contract written in precise handwriting. Agreement between Ezekiel Marsh and associates for the permanent resolution of the Thomas Carter problem. Payment of $200 to be distributed among participants upon completion. The date made her stomach drop. It was from 50 years ago, just 3 days before her grandfather Thomas had supposedly died in a ranching accident. Beneath the contract lay something even more disturbing: detailed instructions for staging a murder to look accidental. The document outlined exactly where to position a body, how to create believable injuries, which witnesses to bribe, and what story to tell the territorial authorities. Her grandfather's name appeared throughout. The most heartbreaking discovery was her grandfather's own confession, written in desperate, shaking letters. He admitted to taking cattle during a brutal winter when his family was starving, but swore he had planned to repay every head once conditions improved. The confession ended with a plea: "I have told you where the remaining cattle are hidden. Please spare my life for the sake of my wife and young son." As Clara gathered the documents, she heard the unmistakable sound of approaching horses above ground. Clara pressed herself against the earthen wall of the hidden chamber as hoofbeats thundered overhead. Multiple voices echoed down through the windmill's wooden floor, and she recognized one immediately: the cold, authoritative tone of Ezekiel Marsh himself. "The sheep tracks lead right to this spot," Ezekiel said above. "Carter's daughter must be nearby. Find her." Clara's heart pounded as she heard boots walking around the windmill's base. She clutched the incriminating documents to her chest, realizing she now held proof that Ezekiel had murdered her grandfather 50 years ago. But why had he kept such damaging evidence? Her question was answered by the final document in the collection: a detailed list of everyone who had participated in her grandfather's murder, along with information about their current lives, families, and businesses. Ezekiel had preserved these papers not as mementos, but as insurance. Any conspirator who tried to expose him would face exposure themselves, destroying their reputations and endangering their families. "She's not here," called a younger voice from outside. "Just her sheep drinking from the spring." "Then where is she?" Ezekiel's voice grew sharper with irritation. "Sheep don't wander this far on their own. Someone drove them here." Clara held her breath as the voices moved closer to the opening above her hiding place. Through the cracks in the floorboards, She could see shadows passing back and forth as Ezekiel's men searched the area. Maybe she went back for help when she couldn't handle them alone, suggested another voice. No, Ezekiel said firmly. Clara Carter is too stubborn to give up on lost livestock. She's here somewhere, and when we find her, we're going to have a serious conversation about staying away from places that don't concern her. The threat in his voice made Clara's blood run cold. Ezekiel clearly suspected she might have found something, but he couldn't be certain without revealing his own knowledge of what was hidden here. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the voices began to fade as the search moved away from the windmill. Clara waited until she was certain they were gone before climbing back up to ground level. The morning sun was now high overhead, and she realized she had been underground longer than she thought. Her sheep had wandered a short distance from the spring, but were still within sight. As she gathered them together, Clara's mind raced with the implications of what she had discovered. Her grandfather hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered by a group of men led by Ezekiel Marsh, and now she had proof. But what could she do with this evidence? Ezekiel owned the bank that held her family's mortgage. He had influence with local law enforcement and territorial officials. Taking these documents to the authorities would likely result in them disappearing, along with anyone who had seen them. As Clara drove her sheep toward home, she spotted a familiar figure riding toward her across the hills. Her father, Boone, was approaching at a gallop, his weathered face etched with worry and something else. Fear. "Clara," he called out as he drew near. "What are you doing out here? I told you never to go near the old Hendricks place." She could see in his eyes that he already suspected what she might have found. The time for family secrets was over, and Clara made a decision that would change everything. "Pa," she said, pulling the documents from her satchel. "I know what really happened to Grandfather." Boone's face went pale as he recognized the papers in her hands. "Where did you find those?" "Hidden under the windmill." "Pa, Ezekiel Marsh killed Grandfather, and he's been using these papers to control everyone who helped him. We have proof now." But as Clara spread the documents between them, they heard the sound of multiple horses approaching fast. Ezekiel Marsh was returning, and this time he had brought more men. Ezekiel Marsh rode up with 6 armed men, his cold eyes immediately fixing on the papers in Clara's hands. She could see recognition in his face. He knew exactly what she had found. "Boone Carter," Ezekiel said, dismounting slowly while his men spread out in a semicircle. "Seems your daughter has been exploring places she shouldn't." "We were just gathering our sheep," Boone replied, moving protectively in front of Clara. "No harm in that." "No harm." Ezekiel's laugh was cold. "Your daughter has discovered something that was meant to stay buried. That constitutes considerable harm to certain people." Clara stepped out from behind her father, holding the documents high. "You mean harm to the murderers who killed my grandfather?" The pretense dropped from Ezekiel's face. "Your grandfather was a thief who got exactly what thieves deserve. Those papers tell only part of the story, the part written by a desperate man trying to save his worthless life. These papers tell the truth," Clara shot back. "They show exactly how you planned his murder and covered it up. And they show how you've been blackmailing everyone involved for 50 years. Ezekiel pulled his revolver, and his men followed suit. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, girl. I've built an empire in this territory, and I won't let some foolish child destroy it over ancient history." But Clara had been thinking quickly while they talked. She had noticed something during her morning rides to town. The weekly territorial court session was scheduled for this very afternoon. Judge Patterson would be hearing cases at the courthouse, and more importantly, there would be crowds of people present. "You're too late," Clara said, surprising everyone with her confident tone. "I already showed these papers to Judge Patterson this morning before I came looking for the sheep. He's calling a special session this afternoon to hear testimony about a 50-year-old murder conspiracy." It was a complete lie, but Ezekiel couldn't know that. Clara could see uncertainty creeping into his eyes. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Why don't you ride into town and ask the judge yourself? I'm sure he'd be very interested to hear your version of events." One of Ezekiel's men looked nervous. "Boss, if there's really going to be a court hearing—" "There won't be," Ezekiel snapped. But Clara could see his mind racing as he tried to decide whether she was bluffing. Boone suddenly spoke up, his voice stronger than Clara had heard it in years. "Ezekiel, even if you kill us both right here, those papers have already been seen by others. Jeremiah Tate was with us this morning when Clara found them. So was Virgil Granger. They both read every word. This was also a lie, but it had the desired effect." Ezekiel's confidence wavered further, as he realized he might be facing multiple witnesses instead of just two victims he could silence. "Here's what's going to happen," Clara continued, pressing her advantage. "You're going to ride into town ahead of us and present yourself to Judge Patterson. You can try to explain these documents, or you can wait for us to do it. But either way, the truth is coming out today." Ezekiel holstered his gun, but the hatred in his eyes burned brighter than ever. "You think you're very clever, don't you? But you've made a fatal mistake. You've forgotten that I still hold the mortgage on your ranch. One word from me, and your family will be homeless by sunset. Then you'd better make sure that word never gets spoken," Clara replied. "Because if anything happens to our ranch, these papers will be in every newspaper between here and the territorial capital by tomorrow morning." For a long moment, the two groups faced each other in tense silence. Then Ezekiel slowly mounted his horse, his face twisted with rage. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Not by a long shot." As Ezekiel and his men rode toward town, Clara felt both relief and terror. She had bought time with her bluffs, but now she had to make them reality. The afternoon court session was real, but she had never spoken to Judge Patterson. Everything now depended on her ability to convince the judge to hear their case, and on finding witnesses brave enough to testify against the most powerful man in the territory. Clara and her father rode hard toward town, knowing they had little time to turn her desperate bluffs into reality. The afternoon court session would begin in less than 2 hours, and they needed to reach Judge Patterson before Ezekiel could spin his own version of events. "Clara, what you did back there was incredibly brave," Boone said as they rode. "But Judge Patterson might not listen to us. He's an honest man, but he's also cautious about disrupting the territorial power structure." "Then we need to make sure he has no choice but to listen," Clara replied. "These documents are evidence of murder, Pa. No honest judge can ignore that." As they approached the town's main street, Clara could see unusual activity around the courthouse. Word had somehow spread that something significant was happening, and crowds were gathering despite the afternoon heat. They tied their horses outside the courthouse and hurried up the front steps. Inside, they found Judge Patterson reviewing his afternoon docket with the court clerk. The judge was a stern-faced man in his 60s, known throughout the territory for his fairness and integrity. "Your Honor," Clara said, approaching the bench with the documents in hand, "I need to report a murder and present evidence of a conspiracy that has lasted 50 years. Judge Patterson looked up with surprise. "Young lady, this court handles civil disputes and minor criminal matters. Murder cases require—" "Please, Your Honor," Clara interrupted, spreading the papers on his desk. "Just look at these documents. They prove that Ezekiel Marsh murdered my grandfather and has been covering it up for decades." The judge's expression grew serious as he examined the papers. Clara watched his face change from skepticism to shock as he read the murder contract, the staging instructions, and her grandfather's desperate confession. "Where did you obtain these documents?" Judge Patterson asked quietly. Clara explained about finding them hidden beneath the old windmill, and Boone confirmed her story. As they spoke, the courthouse began filling with people drawn by rumors of a major revelation about Ezekiel Marsh. "This is extraordinary evidence," the judge said finally, "but I need witness testimony to corroborate these documents. Are there people still alive who can speak to these events?" "Yes." "Your Honor," Clara said, though her heart was pounding. "Jeremiah Tate and Virgil Granger were both involved in the conspiracy. I believe they're ready to testify truthfully about what happened." It was another gamble, but Clara had seen the guilt in both men's eyes during her brief encounters with them in town. She hoped that guilt, combined with the public pressure of a courtroom full of people, would give them the courage to speak. Judge Patterson consulted his pocket watch. "Very well. I'm calling an emergency session to hear testimony regarding these allegations. Bailiff, summon Jeremiah Tate and Virgil Granger immediately." As word spread through the courthouse, Clara noticed that Ezekiel had arrived with several of his associates. He sat in the back of the courtroom, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. But Clara also noticed something else. Many of the townspeople were looking at Ezekiel with new suspicion, as if long-held doubts were finally crystallizing into understanding. When Jeremiah Tate was brought before the court, the elderly man looked terrified. But as he saw the packed courtroom and the documents spread before the judge, something seemed to break inside him. "Your Honor," Jeremiah said in a shaking voice, "I've been carrying a terrible burden for 50 years. It's time I told the truth about what we did to Thomas Carter." Clara held her breath as Jeremiah began his testimony, describing in detail how Ezekiel had convinced them that Thomas Carter needed to die as an example to other potential thieves. He explained how they had staged the murder to look like an accident, and how Ezekiel had kept the evidence to ensure their continued silence. When Virgil Granger was called to testify, the big man's voice was steady, despite the emotion in his eyes. Thomas Carter was trying to feed his starving family, he said. We could have taken the cattle back and run him out of the territory. But Ezekiel wanted blood, and we were young and foolish enough to follow him. The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Judge Patterson banged his gavel for order, but Clara could see that public opinion had turned decisively against Ezekiel. "Mr. Marsh," the judge called out, "these are serious allegations against you. Do you wish to respond?" But when Clara turned to look at the back of the courtroom, Ezekiel's seat was empty. Judge Patterson immediately ordered the bailiff to find Ezekiel Marsh, but Clara had a sinking feeling that he was already fleeing town. The courtroom buzzed with angry conversations as people processed what they had just heard. 50 years of corruption and murder covered up by the man who controlled much of their economic lives. "Your Honor," Clara said, standing up, "Ezekiel still has armed men in town who might try to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses. We need to act quickly." The judge nodded grimly. "Bailiff, organize a search of Ezekiel Marsh's properties immediately. Seize any documents that might relate to this case." He turned to address the crowded courtroom. "Citizens, I'm declaring a territorial emergency. No one is to interfere with this investigation." But Clara knew they needed more than just Ezekiel's capture. They needed to dismantle his entire network of corruption. "Your Honor, there's something else. These documents show that Ezekiel has been using this evidence to blackmail other people for decades. He's built his power on fear and intimidation." Judge Patterson examined the blackmail list more carefully. "I see several prominent names here. Bailiff, I want all of these individuals brought in for questioning immediately." As law enforcement officers dispersed throughout the town, Clara felt a mixture of satisfaction and anxiety. They had succeeded in exposing the truth, but Ezekiel was still dangerous, and his escape meant the immediate threat to her family remained. Her concerns proved justified when a breathless messenger burst into the courtroom. "Judge, Ezekiel Marsh and his men are at the Carter Ranch. They're threatening to burn it down unless Clara Carter surrenders those documents." The courtroom erupted in outrage. Several townsmen stood up, offering to ride out and help, but Judge Patterson raised his hand for order. "This has gone far enough," the judge declared. "I'm forming an official posse under territorial authority. Any man willing to uphold justice, arm yourselves and prepare to ride." Clara was amazed by the response. Men who had been quietly intimidated by Ezekiel for years suddenly found their courage. Virgil Granger stepped forward first, followed by Jeremiah Tate despite his advanced age. Even Samuel Boone, the timid feed store owner, joined the group. "Clara," Judge Patterson said, "you've shown remarkable courage today. But this situation is now too dangerous for civilians. I want you to remain here under court protection while we deal with Ezekiel." "No, Your Honor," Clara replied firmly. "This started because of what I found, and it needs to end with me there. Besides, Ezekiel might negotiate if he sees me, but he'll never surrender to a posse alone." Judge Patterson considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "Very well, but you'll stay behind our armed escort at all times." The posse of nearly 30 men rode hard toward the Carter Ranch, with Clara and Judge Patterson following in a wagon. As they crested the final hill, they could see smoke rising from the direction of Clara's home. The ranch house was still standing, but the barn was ablaze. Ezekiel and 8 armed men had taken defensive positions around the property, using the buildings as cover. Clara could see her father tied to a post near the burning barn, clearly being used as leverage. Judge Patterson called out through a speaking trumpet, "Ezekiel Marsh, you are under arrest for murder and conspiracy. Surrender immediately and release your hostage." Ezekiel's voice echoed back across the distance. "The only thing I'll surrender is Boone Carter's dead body, if that girl doesn't bring me those documents right now." Clara looked at the burning barn and made her decision. "Your Honor, I'm going down there." "Absolutely not," the judge replied. "It's too dangerous." But Clara was already climbing down from the wagon. "He's not going to hurt me as long as he thinks I have something he wants. And once I'm close enough, your men can move in while his attention is focused on me." Before anyone could stop her, Clara began walking down the hill toward the ranch, the precious documents clearly visible in her hands. Behind her, she could hear Judge Patterson quietly positioning his men for a coordinated assault. Clara walked steadily toward the burning ranch, her heart pounding but her steps never faltering. Ezekiel emerged from behind the house, his gun trained on her father, who remained tied near the blazing barn. The heat from the fire was intense even at this distance, and Clara could see terror in Boone's eyes. "That's far enough," Ezekiel called out when Clara was still 50 yards away. "Hold up those papers so I can see them clearly." Clara raised the documents above her head. "Here they are, Ezekiel. 50 years of evidence that you're a murderer and a coward. The whole territory knows the truth now." "The territory knows nothing but lies told by desperate people," Ezekiel snarled. "Those papers are forgeries, and everyone who claims otherwise is a liar trying to destroy an honest businessman." "Then why are you so desperate to get them back?" Clara asked, taking another step forward. "If they're just forgeries, why not let Judge Patterson examine them thoroughly?" Ezekiel's composure cracked slightly. "Because lies can sound convincing to gullible people. I won't let my reputation be destroyed by false accusations." Clara could see the posse members moving carefully into position around the ranch perimeter. She needed to keep Ezekiel talking and distracted for just a few more minutes. "Tell me something, Ezekiel," she said, still advancing slowly. "Why did you keep those documents all these years? Why not destroy the evidence of your crimes?" "Because power requires insurance," Ezekiel replied. "Every man who helped me that night built a life afterward. Businesses, families, reputations. Those papers guaranteed their loyalty by ensuring their silence." "You mean their fear," Clara corrected. "You've been terrorizing people for 50 years, keeping them quiet with threats and blackmail." "I've been maintaining order," Ezekiel shouted. "This territory was chaos when I arrived. Thieves, rustlers, lawlessness everywhere. I brought stability, prosperity, civilization. You brought corruption and murder," Clara shot back. "And now it's over." She was now close enough to see the desperation in Ezekiel's eyes, and she realized something that chilled her blood. This wasn't a man planning to negotiate or escape. This was a man preparing to destroy everything rather than face justice. "You're right about one thing," Ezekiel said quietly. "It is over. But if I'm going down, I'm taking everyone with me." He raised his gun toward Boone, but Clara was ready. She threw the documents high into the air, creating a distraction as papers scattered in the wind. Ezekiel's attention wavered for just a moment as he instinctively followed the flying papers with his eyes. That moment was all Judge Patterson's posse needed. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions as the hidden men opened fire simultaneously. Ezekiel spun around, firing wildly at shadows he couldn't clearly see, but he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Two of his men immediately threw down their weapons and surrendered. The others tried to fight, but the battle was over quickly. When the gun smoke cleared, 5 of Ezekiel's men were wounded, but alive. 2 were dead, and Ezekiel himself sat against the burning barn, with blood seeping from his shoulder. Clara ran to her father and quickly untied him, while Virgil Granger and other posse members secured the wounded outlaws. Boone was shaken but unharmed, and together they watched as Judge Patterson approached the defeated Ezekiel Marsh. "It's finished," the judge said quietly. "Your reign of terror is over." Ezekiel looked up with hatred still burning in his eyes despite his defeat. "You think this changes anything? I own half the businesses in this territory. My bank holds mortgages on dozens of ranches. Without me, this whole region will collapse into poverty. Then we'll rebuild it honestly," Judge Patterson replied. "Something we should have done 50 years ago." As the sun began to set on this tumultuous day, Clara gathered the scattered documents that had started it all. Some were singed from the fire, but most remained intact, enough to ensure that justice would finally be served. The barn continued to burn behind them, but Clara felt only relief. The secrets that had poisoned her family for 5 decades were finally exposed to the light, and the man responsible for her grandfather's murder would face the consequences of his actions. As evening shadows lengthened across the ranch, Judge Patterson organized the aftermath of the confrontation with military precision. Ezekiel Marsh sat under guard, his wounded shoulder bandaged, but his spirit clearly broken. His surviving men had all surrendered and were being prepared for transport back to town. "Miss Carter," Judge Patterson said, approaching Clara as she stood with her father near the smoldering remains of their barn. "What you did today required extraordinary courage. You've exposed a conspiracy that has poisoned this territory for decades." Clara looked at the document still clutched in her hands. I just followed my sheep to water, Your Honor. Everything else happened because people finally found the courage to tell the truth. Speaking of truth, the judge continued, we need to address the practical consequences of today's revelations. Ezekiel's bank holds mortgages on numerous properties, including yours. His businesses employ dozens of people. We need to ensure that justice doesn't create economic chaos. Boone spoke up, his voice still shaky from his ordeal. Judge, we can't pay what we owe the bank. Without that mortgage, we'll lose this ranch. Judge Patterson smiled grimly. Actually, Mr. Carter, that may not be a problem. When we searched Ezekiel's office this afternoon, we discovered extensive evidence of fraudulent lending practices. Most of his loans were made with inflated interest rates and illegal terms. Many of those debts may be legally void. Clara felt a surge of hope. What does that mean for families like ours? It means that honest people who were cheated by Ezekiel's corrupt practices may find themselves free of unjust debts. Of course, each case will need to be reviewed individually, but the initial evidence suggests widespread fraud. As they spoke, Virgil Granger approached with Jeremiah Tate at his side. Both men looked exhausted but relieved, as if enormous weights had been lifted from their shoulders. Clara, Virgil said, I want you to know how grateful we are for what you did today. 50 years we've been living with the guilt of what happened to your grandfather, finally telling the truth. It feels like we can breathe again. Jeremiah nodded, tears in his eyes. Your grandfather was a good man who made a desperate choice to feed his family. He didn't deserve what we did to him, and we've known that every day since. What will happen to you both now? Clara asked with concern. Judge Patterson answered for them. Both Mr. Tate and Mr. Granger have provided full confessions and complete cooperation with the investigation. Given their age, their evident remorse, and their willingness to testify, I expect they'll receive suspended sentences in exchange for continued cooperation. As full darkness settled over the ranch, the last of Ezekiel's men were loaded into wagons for transport to the territorial prison. Ezekiel himself was placed in a specially reinforced wagon, still defiant despite his defeat. This isn't justice, he called out as the wagon prepared to leave. I brought order to chaos, prosperity to poverty. History will vindicate me. History will remember you as a murderer who terrorized innocent people for 50 years, Clara replied firmly. And it will remember that your reign of fear ended when ordinary people found the courage to stand up to you. Judge Patterson climbed into his wagon and prepared to depart with the prisoners. Miss Carter, I'll be recommending you for a territorial commendation for extraordinary service to justice. What you accomplished today will be talked about for generations. As the convoy disappeared into the darkness, Clara and her father stood together looking at their damaged property. The barn was completely destroyed, and there would be much work ahead to rebuild. But for the first time in her memory, Clara felt truly free. Pa, she said quietly, tell me about grandfather. Tell me what he was really like. Boone wrapped his arm around his daughter's shoulders. He was a lot like you, Clara. Stubborn, brave, and completely unwilling to accept injustice. He would have been incredibly proud of what you did today. Together, they walked toward their house, ready to begin the long process of rebuilding their lives free from the shadow of Ezekiel Marsh's corruption. As evening shadows lengthened across the ranch, Judge Patterson stood over Ezekiel Marsh's wounded form with grim authority. The corrupt rancher sat bleeding against the smoldering barn, his empire of fear finally crumbling around him. Ezekiel Marsh, Judge Patterson declared, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, by the authority vested in me by the territorial government, and based on overwhelming evidence of murder, conspiracy, and decades of corruption, I hereby sentence you to death for your crimes against the people of this territory. Ezekiel looked up with hatred still burning in his eyes despite his defeat. You can't conduct a trial without proper procedures. This is mob justice, not law. The evidence is undeniable, the judge replied, holding up the documents Clara had recovered. We have written confessions, witness testimony, and your own criminal records. In cases of territorial emergency involving ongoing threats to public safety, I have full authority to render immediate judgment. Clara watched as the weight of final justice settled over the scene. Virgil Granger and Jeremiah Tate stood nearby, their faces showing relief that their 50-year burden of guilt was finally ending. The other townspeople who had formed the posse looked satisfied that the man who had terrorized them for decades would face the ultimate punishment. The sentence will be carried out immediately, Judge Patterson continued. This reign of terror ends today. Within the hour, as the sun touched the western horizon, Ezekiel Marsh was executed by the territorial posse under Judge Patterson's authority. His surviving men were bound and prepared for transport to the territorial prison, and his corrupt empire was officially dismantled. Judge Patterson approached Clara as she stood with her father near their damaged but still standing house. "Miss Carter, what you accomplished today will be remembered as one of the most important acts of courage in this territory's history. You've freed countless people from decades of fear and oppression." Clara looked at the documents still in her hands. The evidence that had brought down a murderer and exposed a conspiracy spanning 50 years. "I just followed my sheep to water, Your Honor. Everything else happened because people finally found the courage to tell the truth." Speaking of practical matters, the judge continued, Ezekiel's bank records show extensive fraud in his lending practices. His illegal foreclosure threats against your family are void, and his confiscated assets will be distributed to his victims. Your ranch is free and clear of all debts. Boone Carter put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, tears of relief and pride in his eyes. "Clara, your grandfather would be so proud of what you did today. You brought justice for his murder and freed our entire community." As darkness fell over the ranch, the last of the territorial officers departed with their prisoners. Clara and her father stood together on their porch, looking out over land that was now truly theirs for the first time in decades. "Pa," Clara said quietly, "tell me what grandfather was really like." "He was a lot like you," Boone replied. "Stubborn, brave, and completely unwilling to accept injustice. He tried to feed his family during a harsh winter, and when he was caught, he was ready to make things right. But Ezekiel wanted blood instead of justice." Clara walked to the edge of their property where she could see the old windmill silhouetted against the starlit sky. The structure no longer held any secrets. Every document had been recovered, every truth had been told, and every crime had been punished. "It's finished," she whispered to herself, thinking of her grandfather's spirit finally at rest. The sheep that had wandered to the windmill that morning had led her to uncover a truth that changed everything. What had started as a simple search for lost livestock had become a quest for justice that freed an entire territory from decades of fear and corruption. Standing under the vast frontier sky, Clara understood that some discoveries were worth any risk. Her grandfather's murder had been avenged. Ezekiel Marsh had paid the ultimate price for his crimes, and the people of the territory could finally live without fear. The old windmill stood as a monument to how truth, no matter how long buried, will eventually find its way to the light when someone has the courage to seek it. And Clara Bell Carter, the farmer's daughter who followed her sheep to an abandoned windmill, had become the woman who brought justice to a land that had waited 50 years for it. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and determination collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.
A baby bear, barely breathing, left to die beneath a blanket of snow. No mother in sight, no hope, just the bitter wind and the silence of the forest. But fate had other plans. A patrol officer, a loyal German shepherd, and a choice that defied every instinct. What happened next will leave you speechless and restore your faith in what wild hearts can teach us. Before we begin, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and tap that notification bell so you never miss a story like this. The town of Three Cedars, Montana, was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace, but from snow. Thick, unbroken snow blanketed the trails winding through Cedar Pass, a jagged wilderness known for its brutal winters and haunting stillness. The sun, pale and uncommitted, hung low behind overcast skies, casting no warmth, only a dull gray light that filtered through the pine boughs like smoke. Deputy Nate Callahan zipped his jacket higher against the cold as he stepped from his patrol truck and into the knee-deep snow that swallowed the trailhead. The truck's tires crunched faintly, muffled by fresh powder. His breath fogged before him in slow bursts, rhythmic and steady, like everything else about him. Nate was 29, tall, wiry, with a jaw perpetually clenched and eyes a shade of green that looked almost stormy in the right light. He had the kind of face that looked older than his age, like a man who had seen too much too young. 5 years ago, his father, Ranger Clay Callahan, vanished during a solo patrol in these very woods. One moment on the radio, describing strange movement near Cedar Ridge. Next, nothing. No remains, no radio, just a name carved on the side of the ranger station and a family without closure. Since then, Nate had traded his original dream of working in a city homicide unit for the badge of the Three Cedars Sheriff's Department. And every winter, without fail, he signed up for forest patrol. At his side padded Axel, a 6-year-old German shepherd, his coat a blend of black and rich tan, with a silver patch running down his left flank like a badge of honor. Axel had once served as a K-9 in a larger county but was retired early after an injury that left a small scar under his right eye. Despite that, he moved with a sharpness, a quiet authority that made even seasoned deputies take notice. Nate had adopted him 2 years ago, and in that time, Axel had become more than a partner. He was the only soul Nate trusted to watch his back in these woods. "Trail C," Nate muttered, scanning the map on his wrist GPS. "Let's check the lower ridge. Snow's shallow enough." Axel gave a soft woof and surged ahead, nose low to the ground, tail alert. They hiked in silence through frozen underbrush, the only sounds the soft crunch of boots and paws and the occasional call of a raven overhead. But 15 minutes into their hike, Axel stopped. Dead stop. His ears flicked back, then forward. He sniffed the air, then darted sharply to the left, off the main trail. "Axel!" Nate called, heart lurching. "You got something?" The dog didn't answer, of course. He was gone. Nate followed, breaking through stiff brush and low branches, boots sinking deep into the snow with each step. Axel's barking echoed once, low and urgent, not alarmed, but insistent. When Nate caught up, he found Axel circling a large granite outcrop, half covered in ice and moss. At its base was a narrow crevice, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, but Axel had already wedged halfway inside. Then he heard it, a weak, rasping sound, like a kitten's whimper or a cub's. Nate crouched low, flashlight out, and leaned in. Inside the shallow den, shielded from the wind but not the cold, lay a bear cub. It was small, no more than 4 months old, its thick fur matted with blood near the shoulder. Its breathing was shallow, labored, as if each inhale might be its last. One paw twitched. The cub didn't even react to the light. "No sign of the mother," Nate whispered, his voice caught, the old weight of loss pressing into his chest again. "Why are you alone, little guy?" Axel whined softly, lying down at the mouth of the cave, chin on his paws, watching the cub with the patience of something far older than 6 years. Nate stared for a long moment, then turned his radio down to silent. He pulled off his coat and spread it out slowly inside the crevice just beside the cub without touching it. With practiced care, he knelt and reached in with one gloved hand, checking the cub's breathing. It flinched, but barely. Cold, losing blood, probably dehydrated, Nate muttered to himself. "If I move it, it might not make it. If I don't—" He reached for his thermal emergency blanket and began folding it beside the coat. He didn't know what he was doing, not really. Just instincts. Instincts inherited from a father who once told him, "The wild only turns cruel when no one's watching." As he settled in to keep watch, the snow began falling again, soft and steady like nature's huss. The fire crackled low, its embers dim beneath a crude windbreak of fallen pine limbs and thermal blankets. Nate crouched beside it, hands cupped around a battered steel thermos, steam rising from lukewarm coffee like ghosts in the cold. The shelter was barely adequate, a tarp strung between 2 crooked trees, branches stacked to hold back the wind, and Axel curled tightly at the entrance. Inside the tarp, swaddled in a second coat and Nate's emergency heat pack, the bear cub lay breathing, faint but steady. Night had sunk into Cedar Pass like ink, bleeding through the snow-covered landscape. The silence was absolute, save for the occasional creak of freezing branches or the slow inhale of Axel sleeping. Nate hadn't spoken in hours, not since they'd finished stabilizing the cub as best they could. He kept glancing at his watch. 2:16 a.m. His breath plumed softly each time he exhaled. The cub stirred weakly, emitting a muffled whimper. Nate leaned closer, brow furrowed. "Hang in there, little guy. Just a few more hours." Axel lifted his head, ears perked. His amber eyes were alert now, focused on the forest behind Nate, the kind of still, sharp attention that didn't mistake wind for danger. Nate froze. A heartbeat passed. Then he heard it too, low, distant, barely more than a vibration in the trees. A growl. Not close, not yet, but there. Nate stood slowly, grabbing his flashlight and stepping past Axel. The beam cut through the dark in slices of white. Snowflakes swirled gently down, landing like soft ash. The growl came again. Not hostile, not warning. Something older, deeper. He scanned the surrounding trees. "Could be her," he whispered. Axel remained alert, body low, but not aggressive. He was trained for this. Restraint when possible, force only when needed. Nate trusted him more than he trusted most humans, and with good reason. 2 winters ago, in a valley called Copper Ridge, Axel had thrown himself between a puma and a 7-year-old girl who'd wandered from her campsite. He'd taken a deep gash to the throat and nearly bled out in the snow. Nate had been the one who found him, the one who stayed with him in the ICU, and the one who refused to accept retirement as Axel's future. Instead, he'd retrained him, slowly, with patience and care, rebuilding trust, confidence, and most of all, their bond. And now, here they were again, in the snow, facing a different predator. Nate turned off the flashlight and knelt beside Axel, who gave a soft whine, eyes trained toward the northeast. "What do you think, boy?" Nate murmured. "She smell us?" Axel didn't move, but his tail gave one low sweep. Not a warning. Recognition, maybe. Then Nate saw them. Tracks. Not fresh, half covered by wind-blown snow, but still distinct. Deep, wide, heavier than any wolf. Paws the size of dinner plates, leading from the tree line toward the rock outcrop they'd found the cub in, and crisscrossed over those were something else entirely. Boot prints. Human. Nate's chest tightened. He crouched lower, inspecting the prints. Old military boots, size 11 maybe, heavy tread. Not standard issue for search and rescue, not local hunting gear either. These were tactical. He followed them with his eyes as far as the darkness allowed. West, then looping back south. Someone had been here, possibly watching. The cub whimpered again, louder this time. Axel stood up, moved back toward the tarp. Nate followed, unease rising. As he stepped inside, he noticed something else. The cub's eyes were open now, cloudy but conscious. Its little body shook with tremors, but it was alert enough to smell Axel. The bear didn't flinch. Axel sat down slowly, nose twitching, emitting a low chuff. Not a bark, not a growl. Something in between. Nate watched, kneeling just outside the tarp's edge. "She's out there, isn't she?" he said softly. "She's close enough to smell him." Axel looked at him, then back into the dark. The fire snapped again, louder this time. The shadows danced against the trees. Somewhere, not far off, the growl sounded once more, and then silence. Thick, final. They wouldn't sleep that night. Nate knew that, but he also knew one thing now with certainty. The cub hadn't been left behind. It had been taken, and someone was still watching. Morning in Cedar Pass came late and slow, as if even the sun had second thoughts about rising. The snowfall had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving a pale white hush over the trees. Frost clung to the needles like powdered glass, and the light filtering through the canopy gave everything a silver glow. Nate stepped out of the makeshift shelter, boots crunching into ice-crusted snow, Axel at his heel. The bear cub was still alive, still breathing in shallow pulses under the tarp, its warmth preserved for now by layered coats and the soft hiss of a heating pad still working off a half-charged battery. But Nate's mind wasn't on the cub this morning, it was on the boot prints, and the presence behind them. He moved slowly around the perimeter of the outcrop, retracing the steps he'd seen the night before. The prints had been clearer before the wind, but even faded, they were distinct. Heavy stride, deliberate. Someone who knew these woods. He crouched by a fir trunk where the tracks stopped abruptly. Something shimmered just beyond the bark, out of place. Nate stepped closer, brushing snow off the tree's base. There it was, a small black camera, weatherproof casing, low profile, wired into the base of the tree with moss deliberately brushed over the mount. It faced the rocky outcrop directly, where the cub had been found. Nate's brows furrowed. "This isn't a hunter's cam," he muttered. He reached for it, noting the lack of logo, serial number worn off with sandpaper or acid. Only one tiny indicator blinked red, a sign it was active. "Someone's watching," he said aloud, glancing over his shoulder. Axel didn't growl, but he sat with his ears alert, eyes scanning the forest. Nate pocketed the camera in his pack and stood slowly. Whoever planted this wasn't tracking game. This was surveillance. Precise, hidden, professional. He glanced toward the cub, still unmoving, and back to the woods. Later that morning, after the cub was stabilized and wrapped tightly again in layers, Nate decided to return briefly to the ranger substation, located 6 miles down ridge. The wind was light, and the forecast held clear skies for the next 12 hours. He made a makeshift perimeter with scent markers and Axel's blankets, hoping the mother bear, if she was nearby, would recognize the scent and not panic. Then he left Axel behind, reluctantly but necessarily, with a small GPS clip on his collar and enough heat and water to hold for several hours. The snow had compacted slightly under the sun, making the hike easier. By late morning, Nate pushed through the swinging wooden gate of the Three Cedars Ranger substation, a squat log building buried between drifts, smoke rising from its steel chimney. Inside, the heater hummed softly, and the air smelled of pine cleaner and burnt coffee. A woman stood behind the desk, typing with short, methodical strokes. Officer Marlene Jessup was in her late 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with crow's feet at the corners of her eyes and a streak of white in her otherwise jet-black braid. She'd been working in the Montana forestry system for over 2 decades and was known for her dry sense of humor and encyclopedic knowledge of local wilderness. She looked up as Nate entered. "Heard you didn't check in last night. I figured either you got eaten or Axel took the truck." Nate gave her a tight smile and dropped the snow-covered pack at his feet. "Almost neither. Found a cub, injured, alone, but it gets worse." Marlene's eyes narrowed. Worse than an injured bear cub in winter? He pulled the camera from his pack and set it on the counter. Found this staked into a fear, pointed at the cub's den. Not wildlife cam. No ID, no tag, no casing label. Looks like it was wiped. Marlene exhaled slowly, stepping back. "Jesus. You've seen this kind of thing before?" "Not since—" She stopped, jaw clenching. Then she turned and walked toward the back wall, pulling down a laminated map. 10 years ago, a site about 9 miles west of where you were called Haven Creek. It was supposed to be a wildlife behavioral research center, run by a private foundation out of Colorado. Quiet, hush-hush. No press, no public tours. Just a few researchers, a few cages, and some theories about predator coexistence. Nate watched her, tense. What happened? One day, everything vanished. Staff left. Logs erased. Buildings stripped down. Locals say they saw helicopters the week before, black, unmarked. I was a junior at the time, filed a report with the state. Never heard back. And now, there's a cub left alone, watched by a camera that doesn't belong to anyone, Nate said. She nodded grimly. And you found it in the exact radius of where the old Haven site used to be. He rubbed his temples. Something's not right here, Marlene. Someone planted that cub, or separated it from its mother. Maybe for monitoring, maybe for something worse. Or maybe the mother escaped, Marlene added. They locked eyes. Neither said what they were both thinking. If the cub was from Haven, and if the mother was too, it meant there were still animals out there who had once been altered, conditioned, or maybe worse. Nate slid the camera back into the bag. "I'm heading back now. I need to check on Axel and the cub." Marlene handed him a newer heat pack and a sealed ration kit. "Be careful, Nate, and call me if you hear more growls than normal." He smirked, zipped up, and turned toward the door. The wind outside had picked up again, and somewhere in the trees behind him, something was watching. By the time Nate returned to the shelter, the late afternoon light had thinned into a haze of orange and pale lavender. The snow, untouched since morning, lay like a sheet of ice-crusted parchment over the forest floor. Axel met him just beyond the tarp, eyes alert, tail still. He wasn't alarmed, but he wasn't relaxed either. Nate slowed as he approached. "How's our little guest?" he asked quietly. Axel gave a soft chuff and turned toward the shelter. Nate stepped inside to find the cub breathing evenly, its fur slightly fluffed, eyes still closed. The heating pack was nearly drained but had done its job. Nate knelt beside it, letting out a long breath of relief. But Axel didn't sit. He remained just outside the tarp, facing the trees, his body still and low. Nate paused, then rose and stepped back out. "What is it, boy?" And then he saw it. A shape, no more than a shadow at first, moving between the trees like fog slipping through columns. Silent, massive, and unmistakable. A full-grown grizzly bear. Female by the shape and gait, though her movements were stilted, uneven. She was injured, favoring her left foreleg and one flank streaked with dried blood. But she wasn't charging. She wasn't growling. She was watching. The bear stopped some 30 feet away, beyond the perimeter of their small camp. Her massive body rose and fell with slow breaths. Her eyes, small and dark beneath heavy brows, were locked not on Nate, but on the cub. Nate didn't move. Axel stepped forward, deliberately, then lowered himself to the ground, chest flat, head low, tail still. No bark, no growl, just silence. The bear took one hesitant step forward, then sat. She sat up. Nate could hardly believe it. She didn't roar, didn't paw the earth. She just sat down in the snow like a soldier returned from war, too tired to fight. For long minutes the forest breathed around them, slow and cold. Then the cub stirred, letting out a small mewl. The mother flinched. Her ears twitched, and for the first time her head dropped slightly toward the sound. But she didn't move. As if some invisible wall, perhaps made of human scent and canine breath, still kept her away. Nate took a step back, allowing more space between him and the shelter. "It's okay," he whispered. "He's here. He's safe." But she didn't come closer. The bear simply watched, all night. They remained locked in strange communion, man, dog, and bear, unmoving except for breath and the occasional shift of paws in snow. Nate didn't build a fire. He didn't dare. He sat with his back against a rock, Axel resting at his side, both of them facing her. The cub slept through it all, wrapped in silence. At some point past midnight, Nate pulled out the folder he'd taken from the ranger substation. Old maps, hand-drawn copies. Marlene had given it to him as an afterthought. "Not sure if it'll help," she'd said. "It's old. Might even be fake, but it's all we've got." Nate opened the pages carefully, glancing between the sketches. Topographic lines, water sources, tree coverage. But in the corner of one faded sheet was a red pencil mark, a crude X drawn near the southern ridge of Cedar Pass. It wasn't labeled. No GPS coordinates, no notation. But beside it, barely visible under faded ink, were the words, Haven Site, X. He stared at the page for a long moment. The area it pointed to was maybe 3 miles from where they now sat, and it wasn't on any official map. "What the hell were you hiding out there?" he muttered. Axel lifted his head slightly, ears perked. Nate glanced at the bear again. She hadn't moved, but her head had lowered, her eyes now half-lidded. He stared at her, heart thudding. "Were you part of it?" he asked softly. "Did they take him from you?" The bear blinked slowly. She looked old. Not by age, but by wear. Like something that had carried too much for too long. The first flakes came like whispers, silent, slow, harmless. But Nate knew better than to trust a quiet sky in the Montana backcountry. He stood near the edge of the camp, watching the clouds pile like steel wool over the ridgeline, pulled down by something unseen. The air had changed, no longer dry and sharp, but heavy, pressed with static. Axel, sensing it too, had gone still beside the cub, tail curled around his legs, eyes flicking skyward. The grizzly mother hadn't moved. She remained at her distance, seated under a leaning pine, her thick fur catching the first dustings of snow. Her wound along the flank had reopened slightly, darkening the fur, but she didn't flinch. She watched the cub, that was all. "We need to move," Nate muttered, more to himself than to either of them. The shelter they'd made wouldn't hold. Not in a real storm, and he could feel it now, the barometric pressure dropping fast, like a warning in his blood. He scanned the landscape. About 100 yards downslope, half buried in drift and shadow, a massive, fallen tree jutted out over a hollow, its roots twisted like broken ribs. If they could reach it before the worst hit, they might make it through. "Come on," he whispered. He approached the cub first, carefully lifting the fragile body wrapped in coats and thermal blankets. It gave a weak grunt, but didn't resist. Nate slung his pack over one shoulder and signaled Axel, who rose immediately. Then he turned toward the bear. She stood as if she'd understood. He didn't wave her over, didn't speak. He just began walking, slowly, steadily, toward the downed tree. She followed. By the time they reached it, the sky had gone white, the wind sharpened to a hiss, then a growl. Snow began falling in thick bands, not flakes now, but fists. Nate ducked under the arch of the tree's trunk, finding a natural overhang where the roots had lifted earth like a cupped hand. It was tight, but there was room enough. He laid the cub inside first, between his own backpack and a wall of pine boughs he quickly shoved into place. Axel curled beside it. The bear paced once, then, as if by silent agreement, planted herself across the opening, her massive form shielding them from the brunt of the storm. She didn't look at them. She simply stood, hunched against the gale, fur whipping in sheets of snow, eyes narrowed against the wind. Nate didn't know how long he watched her before sleep claimed him. When it did, it wasn't peaceful. In his dream, the wind howled louder, but it wasn't snow. It was ash falling from the sky. Trees stood charred and skeletal, and his boots sank into soft, scorched earth. He walked forward, and at the edge of a clearing he saw a figure. A man with broad shoulders, gray-streaked hair beneath a ranger's cap. His father. Clay Callahan stood beside a great brown bear, not the mother outside, but larger, older, its eyes ancient and full of knowing. His father looked at him, then pointed toward a shimmer of light through the broken trees. "Follow the silence," Clay said, and his voice echoed like it came from underwater. "That's where the truth lives." Then the bear roared, and Nate woke with a jolt. The storm still raged, but less violently now. Snow no longer screamed sideways. It whispered, a slow hush. The inside of the shelter was dim but dry. The cub stirred against Axel's chest, its nose twitching. Nate reached for his thermos, half frozen, and took a sip. Then he noticed something. Tracks. Just outside the den's edge, half covered already by wind-blown snow. Boot prints. Fresh. Someone had been there while they slept. His hand went to the sidearm at his hip, not drawn, just resting there. He slid out slowly, eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but the bear was awake. She hadn't made a sound, but she was no longer dozing. Her nose twitched. Her head turned slowly toward the east, where the tracks vanished. She didn't growl. She didn't follow. She just stared. Nate knelt beside the print. It was deep, wider set than the last ones. Someone heavier and recent. Within an hour, maybe less. He stood and exhaled slowly. The storm hadn't just brought snow, it had brought eyes. The morning after the storm was eerily still. The forest, now blanketed in heavy, pristine snow, seemed to breathe in silence. Not a single bird call echoed. Not a twig cracked. Even the wind had taken a vow of quiet. Nate stood outside the hollow tree where they had waited out the night, scanning the eastern slope. His fingers were stiff with cold, his breath curling in front of his face like smoke. The boot prints from the night before were gone, swallowed by the storm, but a direction remained etched in his mind. East. He adjusted the rifle on his back and whistled softly to Axel. The German shepherd, now fully alert, padded over from where he had been watching the bear cub nap against its mother. Axel was built like a tank in motion, muscular, agile, the edges of his coat tipped with frost. His right ear twitched at the sound and his eyes locked onto Nate, awaiting command. "We're going," Nate said softly. "Keep low." He turned to the grizzly mother, still lying protectively over her cub. Her flank had scabbed partially, her breathing steady. She looked at him once, briefly, and then closed her eyes again, as if trusting him to return. Axel took the lead. They moved quietly through the forest, tracing the slope downward until the incline curved unnaturally, a pattern not formed by erosion, but by something older, deliberate. Nate recognized the change instantly. Terrain altered by machinery, flattened soil beneath the snow. Axel paused and sniffed the air, then veered right toward what looked like a mound of ice-coated earth. Half buried beneath a fallen pine was a rusted iron gate. Vines and frost had wrapped around it like armor. A faint X was still visible on one of the iron bars, painted in faded red. It creaked when Nate pushed it open. Beyond the gate lay a narrow path, flanked by long-forgotten fence posts and a row of nearly invisible signs now weathered blank. The snow grew shallower the deeper they moved in, revealing cracked concrete beneath. Then they saw it. A low, bunker-like building, barely protruding from the hillside, with a domed roof camouflaged by moss and old snow tarps. Solar panels lined the top, half shattered, but some intact. A door stood ajar, its hinges rusted but still functional. Faded black letters were spray-painted on the steel. Haven Site, X. Nate stepped inside cautiously. The air was dry, metallic, sterile, cold but not freezing. Fluorescent lights flickered to life with a low hum, powered, somehow, by the surviving panels above. It was a research facility. That much was clear. Corridors branched off the main hallway. Kennels, observation rooms. One wall bore scratched glass, behind which were behavioral charts, photographs of animals in confinement. Wolves, foxes, bobcats, and bears. Most of the images were shredded or burned. A bulletin board hung askew, its documents yellowed with age. "Jesus," Nate whispered, brushing his hand over a dusty filing cabinet. "They really tried to bury this place." Axel whined softly and nudged a door on the far side. Nate followed. The door led to a narrow stairwell that descended into darkness. Cold air flowed up from below. Axel's hackles lifted slightly, but he moved forward with hesitation, nose low. At the bottom they found a sealed chamber, reinforced steel walls and a digital keypad long since dead. But the door had been jimmied open, wires exposed. Inside, racks of freezers hummed faintly. Still powered. One wall held a panel of emergency batteries, each connected to a small solar converter. Nate approached slowly, brushing away condensation on the front of one of the freezers. A sealed folder sat on a tray inside, held in vacuumed plastic. Nate pried the case open. Inside were documents, handwritten logs, observation notes, dated 5 years ago. The name at the top of several pages hit him like a punch to the gut. Clay Callahan, Senior Wildlife Observer. His father's handwriting stared back at him. Nate sank to the floor, breath caught. He flipped through the first few sheets. Subject 47 shows continued non-aggression under duress. Protective behavior observed around young of other species. Still no signs of conditioned aggression. Requested delay of termination order. Not approved. Subject attempted escape again. This time with cub in tow. Tranquilizer failed. I advised release. Monitoring shift tonight. I'm staying with her. She's different. And then, abruptly, the entries ended. Nate sat in the still cold, the silence pressing against his chest. His father hadn't vanished randomly. He had been here. He had known this bear, perhaps her cub as well. Axel lay down beside him, resting his head on Nate's leg. A comforting weight. "Did you protect them, Dad?" Nate whispered. "Is that why you disappeared?" He looked around the dark, humming space. There were other folders, other names. Most were redacted, but this one wasn't hidden. It was left for someone. For him, maybe. Axel suddenly rose, ears erect. Footsteps. Faint. From upstairs. Nate stood instantly, tucking the folder inside his coat. He moved to the stairwell, hand on his weapon, but when he reached the top, no one was there. Just a faint draft through the broken door. No tracks in the snow. Whoever had been there was gone again. Watching. Waiting. The sky above Cedar Pass had dulled to slate gray by the time Nate and Axel emerged from the cold belly of Haven Site X. The wind had returned, soft but purposeful, moving the treetops in long, slow arcs like a warning whispered too late. Nate stood at the edge of the bunker's entrance, eyes scanning the frozen tree line. Whoever had been watching earlier hadn't left tracks, but their presence lingered like a taste in the air. Axel circled once, ears high, body tense. His nose hovered low to the snow, following an invisible thread. Nate knelt beside him and unzipped the front pocket of the heavy ranger jacket he'd taken from the locker room. His father's jacket. Inside, tucked into a fold of lining, was a folded page, brittle with time. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable. "If you find this, if you're here, then you already know too much. The road forward is not control, it's protection. Let the bear speak. She knows the way." Dad. Nate stared at the words until the cold bit his fingertips. Then he slipped the letter into his vest and stood. "Come on, boy," he said. "We're not alone out here." Axel gave a low, uneasy bark. It happened quickly. A sharp crack of a branch. Then movement. Dark shapes through the trees, fast and trained. Not lumbering or careless like tourists. Not calm like wildlife officials. These were tacticians. Men in black and gray winter gear with no visible insignias. There were 4 of them, spaced out, flanking the old compound. One of them stepped forward. He was tall, wide through the shoulders, with graying stubble and crow's feet that didn't soften his glare. He wore a scarf pulled up to just beneath his eyes, revealing only a line of cold blue irises beneath a black beanie. His name would come later, but now he was just a threat. "We didn't expect anyone to find this place," he said, voice flat but loud enough to carry. Nate didn't move. "You're trespassing. So are you. I'm with the sheriff's department. That won't matter when this place disappears." One of the men behind him, shorter, stockier, with a limp that didn't match the fluid way he carried his rifle, spoke up. "We need to clear it now. The animal's still out there. Cub, too." "Leave the bear alone," Nate snapped. "She's injured, not a threat." "They're both liabilities. This isn't a wildlife rescue, deputy. It's cleanup." The lead man nodded once, almost imperceptibly. 2 of the others began moving toward the direction of the hollow tree where Nate had left the mother and cub. He didn't think, he acted. Nate raised his radio and pressed the emergency call switch. "Dispatch, this is Deputy Callahan. Code Red. Possible illegal operation near Cedar Pass Ridge, requesting backup now. Armed individuals on site." The taller man moved fast, but Axel moved faster. With a low growl that turned to a snarl mid-leap, Axel launched himself into the path of the man heading east. The attacker stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard. His rifle flew from his hands, skidding into the snow. Axel didn't bite. He pinned. That was his training. Disable, not kill. Nate drew his weapon and stepped sideways, using the chaos to slip behind one of the trees. "Stand down," he shouted. But the others didn't listen. The shorter man fired once. Warning. High. Nate ducked, rolled, and fired back. His shot struck the bark behind them, splintering pine into the wind. It was enough. The men broke off formation, disappearing into the woods in opposite directions. Axel stood panting over the man he had pinned, but the man was unconscious, knocked out cold by the fall. "Good boy," Nate breathed. He zip-tied the man's wrists with a plastic restraint from his belt and retrieved the rifle, tossing it into the snow well out of reach. Then he turned to Axel and whispered, "Back to the bear." They moved fast, cutting east through the trees. Snow crunched beneath their boots and paws, and the distant call of a raven echoed overhead. When they arrived, the hollow was undisturbed. The bear mother lay curled tightly around the cub, both blinking slowly in the dimming light. She looked up as Nate approached, her eyes wary. But she didn't rise. She was too tired, or maybe too trusting. Nate crouched beside them and whispered, "You're not alone. Not anymore." He looked to Axel, who sat watching the horizon, ears perked but calm. The shepherd's breath steamed in the cold, chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. They'd survived, for now, but someone had wanted this place gone. Someone still did. The light came not quietly this time. It came bold, golden, slicing through the pines like truth through silence. It washed over the snow-covered clearing where the battle had passed, where a bear curled around her cub, where a dog still stood watch, and where a man waited, exhausted but unbroken. Sirens echoed faintly, bouncing between the ridges, their pitch thin and rising. Then came the hum of engines, real ones, not the silent tread of black boots in the dark. From the north trail, 2 ranger trucks and a sheriff's SUV rolled through the trees. Logos were clear, badges were visible, and most importantly, this time they were the right people. Ranger Eli Bishop was first to step out. His face, stern and angular, looked even sharper in the morning light. Behind him, Deputy Sarah Langford, tall, dark-skinned, and whip-smart with piercing hazel eyes, was already scanning the perimeter with a tactical drone in hand. "We got your signal," Eli said as he approached Nate, "and we brought friends." Nate, leaning against a rock with Axel by his side and the captured man still unconscious at his feet, gave a weary nod. They came to erase it all. The bear, the cub, the research. Eli's eyes flicked to the grizzly, still watching, protective but calm. "Where are the others?" "3 more, Nate said. "They ran north, trained, armed." "Not far, then." Sarah was already giving orders. 2 rangers moved to secure the unconscious man, wrists still zip-tied, gear removed and tagged. A medic checked his vitals while another ranger logged evidence and readied the transport crate. "Axel took him down before he could fire," Nate said. "He tried flanking the den." Eli glanced at the dog, who sat watchfully, silent. "Good dog," he muttered, then turned toward the tree line. "We'll sweep the north edge." Within minutes, Sarah's drone pinged movement. 3 heat signatures along a frozen ridge. The escapees were trying to loop west toward the river, but they weren't quiet enough. By mid-morning, it was over. One was caught scaling a ravine and slipped. No injuries, but no escape. Another was tranquilized near the stone outcrops. The last, short, limping, was brought down by Axel again, who chased and pinned without drawing blood. Eli radioed in. 3 suspects in custody, all breathing, 1 bruised ego. While transporting the captives, Sarah examined a phone recovered from the limp-footed man. Her brows furrowed as she tapped into the encrypted folder. A name appeared. Dr. Richard Hawthorne. Eli looked over her shoulder. "That ghost again." "He's not dead," Sarah said coldly. "He's hiding, and he's still calling shots." A warrant went out within the hour. By dusk, federal agents raided a private compound in Colorado. Hawthorne was found alive, older, but unmistakable. His lab buried beneath layers of corporate shells and false death records. As they cuffed him, he muttered, "They weren't just animals. They were models. Emotion doesn't belong in design." But the world disagreed. Back in Cedar Pass, the bear and her cub were prepped for transport. A specialized wildlife rescue truck rolled through the trees, quiet and secure. Nate stood beside the grizzly. She rose slowly and walked toward the open crate without resistance. No fear, no fight. As if she understood this wasn't a cage, this was safety. The cub was carried carefully by Ranger Hannah Reed, a steady-handed responder with auburn hair and years of trauma work behind her. She nodded once at Nate. "He's stronger than he looks. You did right." Nate said nothing, just watched as the crate doors closed with a soft seal. Eli approached. "We're making this official," he said. "A new sanctuary wing named after Haven, but done right this time. Transparent. Protected. No more shadows." "And the report?" Nate asked. Eli smiled. "I'll let you write that part." Later, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Nate returned to the clearing one last time. The snow had softened where prints once marked it. Axel sat beside him, posture relaxed, head tilted toward the light. Nate stared at the horizon, the wind brushing pine needles like a lullaby. "Dad?" he whispered. "We didn't just stop them. We changed the rules." Axel gave a single, soft bark. Not alarm, just agreement. We don't choose where our stories begin, but we can choose who walks beside us as the pages turn. The little cub didn't just survive. He reminded a tired world of what we often forget. That healing is possible. That even the wildest hearts can trust again. That love doesn't ask if you're ready, it just shows up, quietly, like a paw print in the snow. Through a wounded bear, a loyal dog, and one man's quiet courage, something sacred was restored, not just in the forest, but in all of us. Because in our own lives, we all face storms. We all search for shelter, and sometimes it's the small, trembling soul we rescue that ends up rescuing us. So if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to believe again. Leave a comment. Tell us the name of the animal that changed your life. Subscribe for more stories that honor the bond between humans and the creatures God entrusts to us. And may God bless you, your home, and every quiet moment when you choose love instead of fear. If you believe every soul deserves a second chance, comment Amen below.